Well, thank you very much, and it's an honour to be here. Thank you to the India Foundation, which has organised yet another, what looks to be a very fascinating conference on counter-terrorism. It's also an honour to be here with the Honourable Finance Minister, who needs no introduction himself as one of the deep specialists, not just on economics, but on the economics of J&K State. So it's a pleasure to be here. If you like, I'm going to take a slightly different tack now. We've heard, I think, a lot about the economic impact of terrorism. I want to talk a little bit more about countermeasures in the economic space, and in terms of what can countries do singly and jointly to combat terrorism using counter-terrorist finance mechanisms and more broadly. And one of the challenges around this is that terrorism is comparatively cheap. The impacts are expensive, as we've heard, but terrorist attacks themselves are often very cheap. And in fact, they're so cheap that many terrorist attacks are conducted for less than the level that would trigger a suspicious transaction report to a bank. So if we think about the volume of global financial regulation around this, a lot of the attacks are actually funded for amounts of money that wouldn't even register with a compliance officer in a bank. And I think one of the challenges is around counter-terrorist finance is that it can be effective, but often we are not imaginative enough, and often we are not specific enough to find ways to make it as effective as it could be. And the comments I'm about to offer are going to be my own comments rather than representing British government policy, but I hope they might contribute to the debate. I think a lot of the time on counter-terrorist finance, we think about it, if you like, in terms of CSI counter-terrorist finance. Yeah. It's after an attack, can we reconstruct the funding that led to the purchase of explosives, or the travel that led to an attack, or some of the facilitation networks, perhaps a fake passport or other things that may have been procured. But if you like, that places counter-terrorist finance in that slightly nerdy pocket of people who are not operationalised, people who help clean up afterwards, rather than people who might actually help disrupt attacks in the first place. And I would argue that if you take some of these areas around counter-terrorist finance disruption, the policy and legal framework, where actually there's been a lot of international action, both by individual states and collectively. Sanctions, well, there are now sanctions regimes in place, both nationally and internationally, and the UN 1267 regime is perhaps the apex piece of that. But I think there's been comparatively less focus on disruption. And why? Because disruption is hard. And disruption requires people with knowledge of finance to be involved in counter-terrorism at the beginning of looking at terrorist threats, rather than just after the end. And I would argue that a deep understanding of terrorist finance can help us operationally, both tactically and strategically, when we tackle these groups. And let me give some examples. The first example I would give is a historic one, but not from that long ago, which is of the Tamil Tigers. In 2004 and 2005, the Tamil Tigers engaged in a massive international fundraising effort. And they went to many members of the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora in countries like the UK, Switzerland, Australia, Canada. And they said, if you want to send money back to your families in Mavani, in northern Sri Lanka, which at the time was controlled by the LTT, if you want to visit your family members, you will need to give a unique identifier number so that you can travel or send money. And this unique identifier number allowed, if you like, the LTT structures internationally to conduct a census on a lot of the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora overseas, and then to use those unique identifier numbers, this sounds like the Aadhaar card system, yeah, to actually try and extract more revenue from those members of the diaspora for Tamil Tiger arms purchases. And this is an example where terrorist finance information offers strategic insight into the threat, because that information was crucial to understanding that the LTT were not committed to the ceasefire that was in place at the time, but were actually engaging in a significant surge of arms purchasing internationally. And they were using the fundraising to purchase weapons which offered the insight that they were going to be committed to a renewal of hostilities with the Sri Lankan government. So that is an example of where actually terrorist finance information far from being abstract or after the event, can offer you deep strategic insight into the nature of the threat that you're dealing with. The second example I would give is on kidnap for ransom. Now, kidnap for ransom is one of those areas where it's very difficult for family members, sometimes when somebody is kidnapped, not to pay a ransom. It's a very difficult and emotional situation. But every time a ransom is paid, it encourages further kidnaps. And for some groups, kidnap for ransom can be a significant revenue stream. So let's take some examples around that. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the Abu Sayyaf group in the southern Philippines. And both these groups have used kidnap for ransom as a key financing tool to support their terrorist activities. And here there are actions that can be taken. It can be ruled illegal, or there can be sanctions applied to stop ransoms being paid. And I would point here, of course, I have to offer an advert for my own country. I'd point to the leadership by the UK in this space, but I would also point to the leadership by the United States and the Russian Federation. And all three of these states have been very key in arguing that the payment of ransoms fuels terrorist activity. And this is one area where interventions to prevent it can have a useful operational effect. It may not reduce financing for all groups, but if you can reduce financing for some groups, then that is a helpful thing to do. With Daesh, it's very difficult because Daesh has basically gathered so much assets in the course of its activities, not just in Syria and Iraq, but also in Libya and other places too. But there you can focus in on things like the antiquities trade and try to find ways to disrupt at least the ability to sell on items that may be high value in the open or secondary markets elsewhere. And of course it goes without saying that when it comes to groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, a focus on associated charities is important, like the Jamaat Udawa, like Falayin Sanyat, where some of the financing streams may cut across and end up funding terrorist attacks. In a Daesh era, I would argue that we are also looking at a shift in global terrorist financing. And I would characterize that shift as a shift from a wholesale era to a retail era. What do I mean by that? I think if we go back to the 1980s, if we think about some of the networks, if you look at the Abu Nidal organization, or if you look at the Provisional IRA, there are often transnational networks of financing associated with these groups, and often, if you like, significant wholesale financing that was supporting the different operational networks active in the world. With Daesh, there is an increasing focus on the retail element. It's asking me to self-radicalize. It's asking me to finance an attack that I might conduct, perhaps through theft, through a false loan, through liquidating some assets. And the challenge of a retail financial environment for some terrorist financing is it makes it much more difficult for some of the infrastructure that we've developed over the last decades to tackle that funding stream and that threat. But in the Daesh era, there are some things that are still relevant. We need to be attentive to the misuse of charities. We need to be attentive to cash courier routes and understand the world of finance beyond the formal banking sector. The reality is very few people go to Standard Chartered and ask to open up a bank account in the name of the Indian Mujahideen. Yeah? So one of the challenges is both looking at people who are linked to the formal financial sector, but also looking at ways in which the informal financial sector, hawala, cash couriers, non-cash forms of black money are used by terrorists. And here I would argue that a scalpel is more effective than a bulldozer. Self-evidently, it makes much more sense for us to use the machinery that we have available in states and transnationally to go after the elements that actually link into terrorist financing than to apply machinery unevenly across sectors as a whole. And I think that speaks to this point that it can cost too much money for the banking system, it can disrupt the formal economy at too great a level. So my final comment would be this, but I think there is a challenge ahead in bringing together two tribes, if you like, that have not always had that much contact with each other. On the one hand are the accountants, the counter-terrorist lawyers, but people in financial intelligence units who often have the deep understanding of how markets actually operate. If you want to understand how a hundiwala actually does clearing and settlement, it's those people you want to talk to, not necessarily the intelligence officer, the police walla, or the army officer. And I would argue that two tribes we need to bring together are the people doing operational disruption in counterterrorism and the people doing counter-terrorist finance in the policy and regulatory sphere. Because we need to make sure the operators understand how finance actually works and how it can be used as an effective tool. And we need to expose the finance policy people to operations so they can better understand the changing context of the terrorist threat. And if I may, I will conclude with a phrase that a former boss of mine, Richard Holbrooke, used to use vividly and often too well, which he spoke of the crucial importance of relentless implementation. If we are thinking about ways in which counter-terrorist finance can be useful in the coming years, I think we need to focus on relentless implementation. And that means we need to be as chalak as many of the people are in terms of how they are using finance and financial instruments today. Thank you very much.